Recordings live. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Matt Evans. I'm a GIS specialist for the Indiana Geographic Information Office, and I manage our data harvest program with some other members of the GIO team. I'm excited to be presenting today about a pretty comprehensive analysis of the state of Indiana's geocoding tools that we were able to run this year with some addresses that we are grateful that were provided by the Indiana Department of Revenue, comparing our results to Esri's World Geocoder and some of kind of the key takeaways from that. I'll also be talking about a brief program overview of the data harvest and a little bit of an overview of the specific geocoding tools that we have to offer, and how the data that we collect from all 92 of Indiana's counties is integrated into the geocoding tools. So I will go ahead and get us started. Again, briefly going to go over the data harvest program and a little bit about ongoing data improvements in Indiana, specifically through our office's seed grant. So many of you might know our office is responsible for coordinating statewide geospatial and GIS activities and advancing kind of key framework data sets in Indiana. And the program that kind of accomplishes a lot of that work is called the Data Harvest. And this is a collaborative effort through our office, the Indiana Geographic Information Council, and all of Indiana's 92 counties and the vendors that support a lot of them, as well as the dedicated full-time staff from the different counties. So this is a program that began very early in the GIO's kind of history, all the way back in 2008. Our office was originally established in 2007. So early on in that history, Jim Sparks, the first GIO for Indiana, started reaching out to all of the counties to start collecting data to kind of build some of these key statewide data sets for things like address points, street center lines, parcel boundaries, and then various governmental or administrative boundaries. So things like cities and towns or incorporated areas, emergency service areas, so things like PSAP boundaries, EMS, police or law enforcement, and fire districts, things like that. Took until 2014 until all 92 counties were on board through this kind of voluntary process of submitting their data to the GIO every year. We didn't collect data annually, at least to start with, but once we did get full voluntary participation, did kind of turn this into an annual data collection and data publication process. So currently, as of 2024, we collected 3.3 million addresses, about 560,000 street center lines, about 3.6 million parcel boundaries, and then I think about 13,000 different administrative boundaries that are kind of broken up into these individual data sets that I mentioned. So, and just for reference, the 2025 data harvest is upcoming and will be launched on August 1st of this year. So each year as we collect the data, and we currently partner with the Polis Center at IU Indianapolis to standardize that data before it's eventually released. End up releasing a lot of these resulting data sets in January or February of the following year, and then integrate those into the geocoding tools that I'll be talking about in a lot more in depth in this presentation. Would also note that all of the data we collect through the data harvest is made available to the general public through Indiana Map, with some specific data sets being made available internally only, primarily related to parcels for state agencies and things like that. One key part of the data harvest that we've kind of pivoted towards in the last couple of years is working with the counties to improve their data. A lot of the counties have been meeting the data standard that we ask for the data to be submitted in, which is the NENA Next Generation 911 data model. So last year in the fall, we created and opened a grant program called the SEED grant, which stands for Sowing Enriched and Enhanced Data Sets. And this grant program is primarily focused on helping counties do the data conversion and data improvement to prepare for next generation 911 call routing in Indiana. So one key thing to note with NextGen 911 is that geocoding is kind of a critical component of NextGen 911 call routing. So for addresses or for 911 calls that are not cell phone calls that already have a XY or latitude, longitude associated with that, things like landline or VoIP calls, geocoding that civic address for where the caller is coming from, if it's within a home or a business or something like that, is actually geocoded so that it can be routed to the correct PSAP, and then eventually PSAP standing for Public Safety Answering Point, which corresponds to kind of a 911 dispatch center, and then routed to the correct emergency responding units. So both from the perspective of improving the data for geocoding for NG 911, this grant has become pretty important, but then also for kind of the general geocoding needs that we have at the state level for our various partners and for the general public that might use our geocoding tools and various kind of applications that the state kind of integrates it into. So all of the data that can be worked on through the seed grant, which is really anything that we collect through the data harvest program, is validated through a data validation portal called VEP, which is created by a company called Datamark, which focuses on next-gen 911 kind of data development and data validation to make sure that the data is ready to be used for that eventual 911 call routing, and is required to pass minimum kind of thresholds for the counties to be able to apply for reimbursement for the funding being made available back to them. We're currently happy to share that we're sitting at, I think, 48 counties that have either applied for the grant or received the grant and have active projects ongoing. So anything in yellow on that map means that there's active projects, and then the green or purple colors mean that they're in, various stages of either having applied or have their application approved and have all of the other approvals and contracts and everything kind of working through the process. So these grants are open until January of 2026. So I think we've seen a lot of good traction for this grant program so far, but really hoping to see as many counties as are able or have interest in some kind of financial assistance for this data conversion to take advantage of those funds, since this is a non-competitive grant process. All right, since I went through the data harvest and the seed grant briefly, I'm going to move on to kind of talking specifically about the state's geocoding tools and some of the data considerations behind them. So we have a few different geocoding tools that are made available through our office, both to state agencies or anybody else that wants to use them, both in an API kind of web service format or as downloadable toolboxes that can be used by folks with various GIS softwares. We do create all of this through Esri's kind of software suite. All of these tools, I do like to know, are available for unlimited use and are publicly shared, so anybody can take advantage of them, and are fully free for use, compared to a lot of third-party kind of premium tools out there that do require payment, like Esri requires credits to use their geocoding tools if your geocoding address is in bulk. A lot of the geocoders that we make available and publish are built as a composite locator or geocoder, which is where if you submit an address or location to it, the address will kind of fall back and kind of cascade through a series of different individual geocoder tools to make sure that it can find the most accurate, candidate address and match to that location. So good example would be in the kind of older setup or previous way that we used to create these geocoders, which is called the composite locator, is a given address or location will attempt to be matched to a address point that's collected through the data harvest program. If it couldn't be found in an address point, the address would then fall back to a street or a road center line with an address range also collected from the data harvest program. And then if that data set it wasn't able to match the address, it would fall back to the U.S. Census Bureau's Tiger street center lines, which I'll be talking about in a little bit more depth in an upcoming slide. So kind of a few different options for how those addresses could be matched if, a single data set for, various reasons couldn't actually find that address. Last year, so in 2024, using the 2023 data collected through the data harvest program and kind of some testing that we were also doing with the Department of Revenue with a non-Esri premium third-party geocoder called Precisely, we created a new geocoding setup called the multi-role locator, and this geocoder will attempt to match an address to either an address point or a street center line collected through the data harvest program. So, whichever candidate from one of those two data sets has the highest score would be selected and matched to by the geocoder in that kind of first phase of the geocoding process. And if it can't find the address point or the street center line from that method, again, just like the older setup with the composite locator, it would fall back to the U.S. Census Bureau's Tiger data for validation and matching. We did recently republish a kind of more generalized locator for anybody that's working with, location data that maybe doesn't have a traditional address. So if you're working with PO boxes or maybe sanitized address data that only has a zip code or like the name of a city or a place, we do have a zip code, place, and county geocoder. So in that example, a location would be attempted to match to a zip code, the center of a zip code from these kind of aggregated or generalized zip code boundaries that we have from Esri. Could also look for either unincorporated areas or incorporated areas. So that's kind of the place component of the locator. And then if neither of those geocoders could find that location, it'll then fall back to the name of the county. So again, if anybody's worked with more kind of generalized or scrubbed data, would recommend maybe using that geocoder because the composite and the multi-role locator do not really support those more generalized kind of matching options that zip code, place, and county locator does. All right, next couple slides, I will walk everybody through the kind of primary data sets that are used by the geocoders and some of the specific data quality kind of considerations that we have for them. So the main data sets from the data harvest, at least, that the geocoders used are the address points and the street center lines. So addresses, being a point location, like a GIS point location, representing either a single civic address, so has a house number, a street name, and then some jurisdictional attributes, so things like a zip code, a city, maybe a county, and a incorporated area. And then the street center lines that we use, represent the center of a right-of-way or a real-world roadway, depending on kind of how the county maintains their data. And then these have addresses associated with them based on address ranges on the left and right side of the given segment. So, if a input address can't be found in an address point, it can look in the street center line data and kind of interpolate that address along the street center line based on that address range information that we get supplied by the counties. We have some specific considerations for the address points that I kind of wanted to go over. So first one being placement method. We've seen different counties kind of place their address points differently. So I think the majority of them place the addresses on the center or centroid of a building rooftop. Some of them place their addresses in the center of a parcel. I think this is especially common in maybe agricultural areas where there's not necessarily like a primary residence on the parcel, but that parcel has been addressed or had an address assigned to it. So that's a somewhat common method for placing those addresses. And then a few counties also place their address points on the kind of the primary access point for a given structure, parcel, multi-unit, multi-family development, something like that. Another key consideration that we've kind of been diving into more and more in the recent years is sub-addresses, which would be things like your units, condos, suites, or duplexes, or fractional addresses for maybe duplexes or townhomes are a good example, or maybe upper floor dwellings in kind of formerly single family homes that have been split up into multiple, living spaces. So the screenshots I have on the right side of the screen there show a couple of different ways of maintaining the address data for multifamily buildings specifically. So the one on the left you can see has a single address point for that kind of pretty large, probably 40 plus family apartment building for 210 North 9th Street. So maybe missing some of that more kind of comprehensive sub-address creation within that specific building. And then on the right side of the screen, on that second screenshot, you can see another multifamily building, in this case representing condominiums, has a lot of different addresses with some specific information, the condo representing what type of unit it is, and then the unit ID or the unit number below condo on each address. So something like condo number 208, kind of a little bit more of a comprehensive way of generating those address points for that sub-address information. Other key considerations for the address points are the jurisdictional attributes that I mentioned on the previous slide. So some of the most key ones would be the zip code and the postal community, since most addresses that are entered into the geocoder have a zip code and a city name, city typically corresponding to the postal city or postal community. The name of the incorporated area that an address falls within, if it falls within an incorporated area, or unincorporated if it's not within an incorporated city or town, and then the name of the county that the given address is within. So a lot of these things we do post-process on the data if we don't collect it from the county, but there are some kind of caveats and possible data concerns with, the processing of that information if we don't get it from the county, which I'll talk about in an upcoming slide as well. We also have some key considerations for the street centerline data. So I will start with the directionality of the streets. So since the streets are line segments, each specific segment has a beginning and an endpoint. So if you look at the screenshot on the right-hand side of the screen there's a little arrow marker at the endpoint of each of these street center lines. So as a geocoder is attempting to kind of interpolate the location of an address along that center line based on that address range information. So good example on that middle segment would be those addresses go from 401 to 447 on the right-hand side of the street. The directionality of that street does matter for where that address gets placed. So if that segment was flipped, with that arrow marker being on the northern end of the segment instead of the southern end, you might have that address be placed in the kind of the wrong segment of that actual block. Jurisdictional attributes for the street center lines are a little bit more complicated than they are for the addresses because these are line features rather than the points. And just like the address ranges on the street center lines, the jurisdictional information is associated to the street through the left and right fields for those, certain values. So that would be things like the left and right zip code for a given street, the left and right city or postal community, the left and right incorporated area, and even the left and right county or state when you're working in areas on, streets or roads that are along the border of a county, or even streets or roads that are along the border of Indiana and one of its neighboring states. So those left and right values typically correspond to the addresses that are on, either side of the street. So those are things we also post-process as much as we're able, since we get this information kind of less widely with the street center lines from the counties than we do for the address points, but also some kind of data considerations and data quality considerations to keep in mind as we're doing that. There's also different ways of maintaining the address ranges. So those are actual versus theoretical address ranges. So on a given street for an actual address range, that would be where the address range information only includes actual assigned or existing addresses on either side of the street. So again, using that example of that middle segment or middle center line from this screenshot on the right-hand side of the screen, if it was an actual address range, that would be something like 401 to 447 on one side of the street segment, and then 403 to 436. I can't read it super well on my little screen here, but for that specific street for those address ranges, where theoretical address ranges are more kind of like 100 block addressing. So the way that might be populated on that same exact street would be 400 to 498 on one side of the street and 401 to 499 on the other side of the street. In most jurisdictions, odd addresses are always on one side of the street and even addresses are always on the other side of the street, but that is not always the case, kind of depending on how different planning jurisdictions and addressing authorities assign their addresses. So there's some specific fields in the NextGen 911 data model that we work with the counties on transforming their data to that can help kind of track how the addresses are populated on either side of the street, called a parity. We also need to consider offsets for the street center line. So when a geocoder is matching an address based on a street center line, by default, it will match it kind of literally along the street center line segment. So you can kind of see on that screenshot there, there's some addresses in the center of each of those streets that represent the, the 100 blocks of these streets. So that's kind of approximately the location by default where the geocoder will place an address if it matches to that street. So when we create a geocoder, we apply an offset for street center line matches so that it will push the address off of the actual street segment and ideally kind of place it outside of the right-of-way area, hopefully getting you within a parcel. But there's definitely some variation in kind of right-of-way widths in different communities, urban versus rural, and then different kind of types of subdivisions. All sorts of different areas have different, right-of-way areas. So by default, we apply an offset of about 30.5 feet on either side of the segment, which in typical areas, kind of like we're looking at on the screen here, should place the address actually within the parcel to get you closer to where that address actually is instead of kind of in the middle of the street. But definitely worth noting that there are areas where that amount of an offset is not sufficient to actually get it within a parcel boundary and ideally kind of close to the building that address is within. We've also started to integrate both alias and alternate street names within our data, specifically in the kind of format or methodology that NENA, which is the National Emergency Numbers Association, has outlined in the Next Generation 911 data model. So alias street names are, since local governments and planning authorities, planning commissions have the ability and authority to assign street names and addresses within their communities, whether that's an incorporated area or unincorporated areas of a county. There are a lot of areas where certain streets have been renamed when they cross a given boundary. So I think we typically see these, especially in cities and towns, is applying to states and U.S. highways. I like to give the example. I live in Richmond in Wayne County out in eastern Indiana. We have US 27 that goes through town and US 40 that goes through town as well. And US 27 gets renamed as Chester Boulevard through a good amount of Richmond. And then US 40 becomes Main Street. And then through the downtown area becomes North and South A Street. So making sure that this information can be accurately reflected in the geocoder's kind of reference data is important to make sure that the addresses can be validated and matched regardless of how the user kind of input addresses are formatted. Last year, we also started integrating alternate street names into the geocoder tool. So this is less about actually renaming streets where they enter different jurisdictions, but more focused on how different users might be spelling street name information. And a really good example of this would be county roads. So in the NextGen 911 data model that we work with, the street name pre-type information is populated as county road and fully spelled out. But if you're driving in kind of a rural area and look at street signs, you might see most county roads are populated or kind of typically written without that pre-type value. So that would be something like a value of North County Road 1000 West, maybe typically being entered as North 1000 West. So just completely without that street name type. So in the NextGen 911 data model, we do relate this information back to the actual GIS data is a flat table that's related to the address and the street centerline data through NGUIDs, which stands for the NENA Globally Unique ID. So if you look at the bottom section of the screenshot on there, you can see those unique IDs that start with URN, emergency UID GIS. So it's basically a unique identifier for every single record in the GIS data that feeds NextGen 911 systems. And that can be used to relate a given specific type of spelling or kind of alias street name in different communities back to the GIS data. So gives a lot of flexibility for how the geocoder can accurately match information, regardless of how a user's entering that address, whether that's US 40 versus East Main Street or North County Road 1000 West versus North 1000 West. So I think we've seen this makes some pretty big improvements to geocoder match rates, specifically in areas that have had those alias street names assigned, or regardless of how users are entering their addresses. So we have a few million records, I think, for alternate street names for the address and the centerline data, and then have started working more and more with counties to integrate their alias street name information in a format that we can relate it back based on those globally unique IDs to the GIS data to make sure that those can be validated and located accurately. We also, before we create the geocoding tools, identify valid data for geocoding and only include data in the geocoders that has been identified as valid. So this applies both to the address points and the street centerline data. For the address points, it's pretty straightforward. We just need to make sure that the addresses have a street name and a house number. So that applies to the vast majority of the addresses do kind of meet that quality check, but a few of the ones that maybe represent kind of miscellaneous addresses like utility infrastructure or things in the right of ways that don't have typical addresses do get dropped out of the data set before they get fed into the geocoding tools when we create them. Street center lines are a little bit more complicated. We do require the streets to have their left and right address range fields be fully populated. And all street centerline segments must have a valid or just must have a street name attribute populated. So in 2024, we did have 23 counties that did not have their street centerline data get fed into the geocoder because they do not have address ranges associated with their street centerlines. So in these cases, the geocoder cannot find any potential matches to a street centerline segment. And if it can't find an address based on an address point, it will then automatically fall back to the U.S. Census Bureau's Tiger data. Thankfully, a lot of the counties that do kind of meet that criteria, which is kind of that tan color on the map for the county boundaries, have applied for the seed grant and will be working on address ranges as part of their projects. So I think within the next year, we'll see some pretty significant improvement on making sure that as many counties in Indiana have valid street center lines for geocoding possible, which I think we're pretty excited about. Mentioned earlier that I would go over a little bit of information about the U.S. Census Bureau's Tiger data. So this is a program that the Census Bureau has had for a number of years to create GIS data that represents physical and cultural features that are relevant to census activities. So they do create street centerline segments with address ranges across the country. Would note that that data is not always, completely populated, maybe accurately drawn, or even drawn fully. So I have two screenshots on the right-hand side of the screen there. The first one with the yellow segments on it is showing the center lines from the Census Bureau's Tiger program. The bottom screenshot is showing the kind of orange segments showing the data that we collect from that county in the data harvest program. So I highlighted in red a couple of different boxes that show some missing data from the Census Bureau. So those are some areas that, some of them are not developed yet, like new subdivisions that have been approved, but maybe not fully built yet, at least according to the imagery that we have below the screenshots there. And then some of them you can see kind of on the middle right section of that upper screenshot, there's some kind of spotty segments, not the entire street has been drawn in the Census Bureau's data. So maybe in different areas around the state, a bit of a caveat on kind of the quality of the Tiger data for geocoding purposes. You can also see it's drawn a little bit differently in both of these different versions of the data. The primary example being there's a roundabout in the very middle of the screenshot on the bottom. And then in the top screenshot from the Census Bureau, that just comes to kind of a straight T intersection. So drawn a little bit more accurately based on kind of the real world on the ground conditions by the county, where the census has it a little bit more generalized. One thing I wanted to make sure we talked about as well is some of the challenges we have with populating zip code information. So we did not collect zip code information from about 1/3 of both the addresses and the street center lines that we collected from the counties in 2024. We do attempt to augment the street and address data with zip code and postal city or postal community information as much, pretty comprehensively, but there are some potential kind of data quality issues based on the data sources that we use. So there's definitely some things to think about when considering aggregating zip code data to polygon features that can be kind of used to overlay and intersect, address points and street center lines with. So zip codes are not actually, area or polygons. They are sets of mail carrier routes and points of delivery that the USPS uses to route mail to the, various mail carriers. And USPS has some different address validation APIs that can return zip code and zip+4 information on addresses, but those are not suitable, and specifically in the terms of use for those APIs, not allowed to be used for anything except for shipping or mailing services, not supposed to be used for database development or data improvement, things like that. So we currently have been using Esri's from the Living Atlas of the World zip code boundaries, which on the screenshot and that map on there is the red polygon feature to augment the address point and the street center line data with zip code information when we don't get it from the county and can trust that it's fairly authoritative. So Esri does derive their zip code data from TomTom, and I think we found last year that they're missing a handful of zip codes across the state, especially in kind of small, rural, unincorporated areas that do have their own post office that delivers the mail for the residents and businesses within that area. So found that we really need to look for something that has a little bit more of a comprehensive list of zip codes. We've also looked at zip code boundaries or zip code tabulation areas that the US Census makes available. Those are specifically created to align with other census boundaries. So things like census blocks, block groups, tracts, places, and counties. So there's a little bit of reservation on kind of how they're drawn based on that. And those are also missing some of those same zip codes that Esri is missing. So again, maybe overgeneralizing some of the zip code information in these rural areas. We found USPS also has some zip code information, but these are also generalized boundaries and they're only used by the USPS for some specific kind of visualization and mapping applications. So that's one we haven't investigated a lot yet, but given that it's coming from USPS, might be a promising and at least slightly more authoritative data source than Esri's at least. We've also been submitting our data to the National Address Database, which is a program that the U.S. Department of Transportation administers. So specifically the address point data, we submit annually as we collect and release it from the data harvest to the National Address Database. In recent years, USDOT has been validating that information compared to the actual master address files that USPS has, and then returning that information to us. So if an address can be validated to the USPS data, they will populate the official zip code, zip+4, and postal city information for each record that we send them. And then we can see if we're, having any that are incorrectly populated on our end, or investigate those that are that were not able to be validated by USDOT and USPS. So those are the values that are used in the map on the right-hand side of the screen for the green and the blue address points. So you can see, based on USPS's kind of official determination, those values do not perfectly match up with any of the polygon features that we have from the different kind of third-party zip code data providers. So because the USDOT does this work after we release the data harvest products, we've been considering ways that we can kind of go back and then backfill zip code information in the data, but have not started that yet. But I think that seems like possibly the most promising way that we can start to include more accurate and authoritative zip code data within the address points, at least, and then eventually look at how we can do this with the street center lines when we don't collect that from the counties if they're not maintaining it. All right, so I went through some information about, how we collect the data, how we use the data to create the geocoders, and some of the kind of the data quality considerations. So I'll spend the remainder of my time here to go over some work that we did this year to kind of comprehensively analyze the quality of our geocoder. So we were able to collect about 3.2 million addresses from tax year 2024 from Indiana's Department of Revenue to geocode in order to kind of evaluate the quality and accuracy of our geocoder. We did trim that data down to about 2.7 million addresses after we removed some duplicate addresses to kind of minimize the processing power that was required to do all of that geocoding. We were then able to geocode all of those addresses using the multi-role geocoder that we created that I talked about earlier. Also geocoded all of those addresses using Esri's World geocoder, and then we're able to compare the results of both tools, especially to evaluate the quality of our office's geocoding options. Reason we did this is, again, to support eventual next-gen 911 call routing in Indiana, to kind of take a closer look at the county's data that we collect through the data harvest. The geocoder is kind of continuing to be used more widely by various state agencies, so making sure that it's as accurate and robust as possible is something that's definitely important to us and our different state agency partners. And then the geocoder is exposed again for free and unlimited use to the general public. It's integrated into the main map viewer in Indiana Map for anybody that wants to search addresses. So we really want to make sure that the tools are as accurate as possible, like I mentioned. The way that we did this was to, before we geocoded anything, assign a unique numeric key to each of those 2.7 million addresses. We created a county field based on the zip code, at least for the sake of summarizing the results, with the caveat that not all of the zip codes that we received from DOOR based on user input addresses were valid. Some of them were blank, some of them were, just not a valid zip code based on the Indiana's kind of subset of zip codes. And then, of course, since zip codes aren't a true boundary, there's some kind of caveats with using this to aggregate the data to the county level. And then not every zip code is within a single county. I think in most cases, they typically are, but there are some cases where, at least based on the boundary information we were looking at, that they do cross those county lines. So it's a bit of a caveat with summarizing this data at the county level, but I think it did give us at least a pretty decent starting point at looking county by county at the underlying data's quality for geocoding purposes. Like I mentioned on the last slide, we then geocoded all of these addresses through both the multi-role locator and Esri's World geocoder. And then after we joined that information back to each other, based on that unique key that I mentioned, we were able to generate lines between the returned address locations, or the XY and lat long values from both geocoders, and then could calculate the distance between those addresses in miles, and then add some different information about kind of the return from the geocoder that we could compare. So things like address types, if it was matched, what score it received from the geocoder, things like that. Some general high-level findings are that we found that the geocoder that we create and Esri's geocoder have minimum match scores that are different from each other, and place addresses, very slightly different when they do place them within the same building or parcel or rooftop, something like that. Some, very small, maybe 5 feet of difference between them typically. Found that Esri will match their addresses to scores that are as low as 75. So that means that it might match an address to something that has an incorrect zip code, maybe an incorrect city name, or maybe a flipped directional on a street. So that might be something like East Main Street versus West Main Street, might get successfully validated through Esri. And then in our case, we won't match an address through the data harvest data unless it matches a score at least 92. So definitely a lot higher than how Esri has it configured. And then as low as 85 for the US Census Bureau's Tiger data is that kind of fallback to catch any addresses that couldn't be validated through the data harvest data. This is kind of what led us to look a little bit more closely at the different address placement methods that the different counties have. This drives some of the kind of buckets of distances between the addresses that I'll show in the next slide. So building rooftop center versus a property access point versus a parcel center. We did find that both geocoders located most addresses correctly, to an identical house number, an identical street name, identical zip code, and identical postal city, and very nearby one another. And then for any addresses that were pretty far apart from one another from both geocoders, we found that our tools were typically matching those locations with a very high confidence level or score, often above 98% for that kind of score, and typically had a good address type. So that would be something like an address point or a street centerline address based on those address ranges that I was talking about early in the presentation. Those tables don't look quite right. They did in my presentation, but I will try to walk through those if anybody's seeing the black bars and white bars for some of the tables there, but I'll make sure that we make this presentation available for anybody that wants to look at it after the fact. So we did find that the multi-role locator, okay, thank you, Steve. That's good. I don't see it well on my end, but I'll pull it up on my other screen so I can walk through this okay. We did find that both Esri and our locator or geocoder were able to match the vast majority of the addresses. So approximately 2.67 million of the addresses were matched by both geocoding tools. There were a handful that were unmatched by our geocoder, but were matched by Esri's. That was that 7,656 number. And most of the addresses that were not able to be matched couldn't be found by either geocoder. That's that 40,477 value in the upper left of all of these four tables. A lot of those addresses were PO boxes, which our geocoder can't validate because they don't have a house number to street name. We don't have kind of PO box information built into our geocoder. You can see in the table below that, it compares the percentages of the Esri geocoder to ours. So they had slightly more addresses that were matched, very similar amounts for tied, meaning that there were two or more candidate addresses that had the same score, and the geocoder couldn't select which one to match to. So it just kind of picks one arbitrarily, or the first one that's returned at least. And then we had slightly more addresses that were unmatched than Esri's did. So we had about 49,000 that our geocoder was not able to match, and then Esri had about just under 43,000 that it couldn't match. If we look at the bottom of those three tables on the left-hand side of the screen, you can look at the different address types that the different addresses matched to. So in this case, the main takeaway that I found was Esri matched a lot more addresses to a sub-address, so that kind of unit level information. They matched about 216,000 to a sub-address. Ours matched about 96,000. We matched more addresses to point addresses and street addresses than Esri did. And I think a lot of that's from kind of the cascading effect of addresses that couldn't be found by our geocoder to a sub-address. Instead would find it to an address point without unit level information or a street address based on those address ranges. And then the bottom four, blank meaning that an address was not able to be matched at all. So street address extension, street intersection, or street name, or some of those kind of lower quality, less accurate address types. So street address extension being if a address is on the correct street, but it couldn't find it based on the address range, like it might be 199 East Main Street, where the street center lines range only goes to 198. It will still match it to that street segment and kind of try to interpolate it and move it a little bit away from the street. We had more of those, about 8,300 that matched that method, where Esri had 1,900. Street intersection, meaning the intersection of two streets. We didn't have any addresses that matched that address type, where Esri had, almost none, just 14 of the 2.7 million. And then street name, meaning that it could only match to the name of the street, couldn't actually find a house number based on the address range to match to. So ours and Esri's were very similar, and they're just over 11,500. Esri had slightly more that matched to that than we did. And again, we were not able to locate about 49,000, and then Esri's tools were unable to locate about 42,000 of those addresses. The right-hand side of the screen shows a table showing a breakdown of the distances between the addresses returned from our geocoder and Esri. So the vast majority of those addresses were under 500 feet apart, which is kind of the middle part of that table, which is 0.09 to zero point 0.1 feet. And 84% of them were within 53 feet of each other. One thing I mentioned earlier about the different kind of address placement methods, we did see a lot of addresses. About 28,000 of them were between 0.1 and 0.2 miles apart. A lot of those were from those different address placement methods. So in maybe rural areas, kind of larger parcels where the house might be pretty far set back from the driveway or the right of way, where we have addresses at that property access point and Esri matched them maybe to the top of the house. Those are a lot of the kind of drivers for those 28,000 lines that were 0.1 to 0.2 feet. Then if we go all the way to the bottom of the table, at lines that are greater than 5 miles apart, that accounted for 3,527 of that 2.73 million addresses that we geocoded. And I have a few slides to finish up here that will kind of highlight some of the specific discrepancies between our geocoder and Esri's and looking at some of the lines that were generated between them. So a lot of these represent the lines that are greater than 5 miles apart. So ones that you can see either our geocoder or Esri's geocoder misplaced it pretty significantly, which is why the returned addresses are so far apart. So we had a couple of different communities that had quite a few addresses that ended up being fairly far apart. So the first one was Logansport, which had 316 pretty significant mismatches between our geocoder and Esdras geocoder up in Cass County. Ours was often correct, but not always correct. I think we found that a lot of the time this was from reversed directionals on the streets or on the addresses or the streets that Esri matched to. So that a good example of that would be North County Road 1000 West versus East County Road 1000 North. We saw Esri kind of match a lot of those to the reversed direction of those streets. So if you look at that screenshot, it's kind of a mess with all of those lines being densely clustered with each other. A lot of the ones that are almost straight east-west or north-south are good examples of where kind of it was reversed along the addressing grid with those directionals and it mislocated it. We also had a pretty good amount, 137 of discrepancies in North Vernon down in southern Indiana. In this case, I think we found our geocoder was almost always correct, and Esri's was typically incorrect. Not sure exactly what the issue was with Esri's locator. I think a lot of them were lower scoring addresses where, around that 75% score, where ours were nearing 100 for most of them, and we're pretty confident that ours located them correctly. This next slide here shows some pretty significant discrepancies, almost the entire way across the state for some of these based on incorrect zip code or city information that the geocoder attempted to match to. So the first one on the left side of the screen had a bunch that Esri matched. And I should have mentioned on the previous slide, anything with that kind of arrow marker is pointing towards where our geocoder placed it. And then the beginning of the arrow kind of shape on there is where Esri's placed it. So on the left side, Esri's placed all of these addresses in northern Indiana up near Kokomo and Marion. Ours placed them in southern Indiana near Evansville in one kind of specific community. You can see in the middle screenshot, there was some confusion in Esri's geocoder between the city of Decatur up in northern Indiana near Fort Wayne versus Decatur County. So Esri's was matching those to the city of Decatur, where those were supposed to be matched to Decatur County. Another example very similar to that is the city of Jasper versus Jasper County. So Esri's matched those addresses up in Jasper County in northern Indiana, where ours matched those around the actual, incorporated area of Jasper. We have a few examples of missing alias street names that I talked about earlier in the slideshow. So a couple examples of those are US Highway 33, which is also known as Goshen Road in Allen County. So we can see that Esri's locator or geocoder correctly placed those, along US Highway 33 or Goshen Road outside of Fort Wayne. All of ours place those to a single point on an actual street called Goshen Road that does not have an alias street name within the Fort Wayne actual incorporated area. Another example of this would be Old State Road 37. Esri's geocoder placed these correctly near Martinsville in Morgan County, and then ours placed them on Old State Road 37 in Monroe County near Bloomington, where our data that we received from the county had like a local street name. It was something court. I don't remember the exact name of it off the top of my head, but that's also known as Old State Road 37. So ours placed them, almost an entire county away in the incorrect location. Talked a lot about sub-addresses earlier in the presentation, so wanted to kind of show some specific examples of what this might look like, either where our geocoder incorrectly placed those, although they're kind of close to the right location, or Esri's placed those in the incorrect location. So the left screenshot there shows a mobile home park in some community, and we did not have sub-address information in the address point data we collected from the county. So all of those addresses matched to a single address point kind of near the entrance of that community. And then on the right side of the screen, this is a case where Esri didn't have sub-address information, but ours did, again, with those arrow markers pointing to where our geocoder placed them. So Esri's geocoder placed all of those to a single one of the apartment buildings that had, maybe a single set of like unit ranges within it, where ours was able to place them to the actual building that those specific units fell within. Those are just a few examples, kind of to show some of the major differences in the results from the different geocoders, just to kind of get a sense of what some of the different mismatches and disconnects look like, and then maybe some of the more minor ones as we're hoping to work with the counties on getting more high quality sub-address information integrated into their address point data. So for resulting information, we created a pretty comprehensive report, I think around 40 something pages, that we very recently made available for anybody that wants to read through it. So it goes in more depth through the methodology that we took through this project and shows pretty detailed breakdown of the results from both the Esri and our geocoder, including some of these discrepancies that I looked at in the last couple of slides. Has some sanitized address information, kind of specifically just street names, not actual, house numbers that have been vetted by DOOR with a disclaimer from them at the beginning of the document, since this was using, taxpayer addresses for this analysis. We also created a dashboard that shows detailed geocoder breakdowns by county, both on the percentage of addresses matched, the addresses that were matched to the multi-role versus the Tiger geocoder, and then very detailed information about kind of the specific address types that were matched to in each county. Also has some specific validation metrics from VEP, that data mark tool for data validation that I talked about very early in the presentation, to kind of show across the state some of the different kind of underlying data quality from those validations that relate to geocoding. Links to both of these, the document and the dashboard, are available on the webpage we have on our Enterprise GIS team's website, which is that GIS Modernization Program hub site. Would note that if anybody wants to take a look at these can both be accessed from in.gov/GIS. And if you go to our Enterprise Operations page, you can find that pretty easily. Believe we also have a link to that page on the Data Harvest website under the resources section, which is dataharvest.gio.in.gov. If anybody has questions on those dashboard and report, I'd be happy to talk through things more with you at a later time if that's of interest. So real quick, since we're getting pretty close on time here, I'll go through some next steps for us after we've done this analysis. So we're going to be working to identify a little bit more comprehensively some data issues and data gaps at the county level that might cause some of these unmatched or incorrectly located addresses. And once we do that, without sharing specific addresses, work to share some of that more detailed feedback with data stewards at the county level. Like I mentioned earlier, identify some more accurate and authoritative methods to assign zip code and postal city or postal community values in the address point and the street centerline data. Continue to integrate improved data, which really especially includes street name aliases and sub-addresses into future versions of the geocoders. And then work to kind of continue running this analysis at least once a year as we update the geocoder once a year, and maybe even identify methods that we can track some unmatched requests that are made to the REST API that we can eventually work to share some of that feedback with the counties and the data stewards to continue improving the data that feeds these tools. And that covers everything that I had to go over today. I have a couple of QR codes here if anybody's not familiar with our newsletter or a feedback survey for our office. So if anybody would like to check those out, you're more than welcome. If anybody has any questions and have not put anything in the chat, feel free and I'll be happy to answer it before our time's up at noon. And I will go ahead and go in the chat and make sure I didn't miss anything at this point. Thank you for sending that link, Rick. I appreciate it. I can stick around for a couple minutes, so if anybody has questions. Oh, yeah, London, that's a great question. So we had done, I mentioned earlier, another analysis with Door last year about with a geocoder released by Precisely. And we did a lot of testing on, it was about 250,000 addresses, and found that if we were below 92% for the multi-role geocoder, the tools were having a lot of issues mismatching addresses to the wrong street directional, like I talked about. East Main Street versus West Main Street. If even at like 91 or 90% match score, it might match it to the wrong one and put it, in the wrong zip code, things like that. So that's where we did 92 for the data harvest data. The Tiger data, we kept at 85, is a little bit of a lower sensitivity than the data harvest data to give a little bit more flexibility if it couldn't find an address in the data harvest data, but still keep it fairly high. So, and that's something that we've done, I think, back since about 2020, kept it around 85. So I don't have a great answer on why it's 85 specifically, but that's kind of why we chose to keep it a little bit lower than the data harvest data specifically. Yeah, Sarah, good question as well on comparing the multi-role locator to other geocoders. We've looked a little bit into the Google geocoder. I know they charge you once you reach over 10,000 addresses that you run through it. So I think we know that there's different state agencies that are using these third-party kind of premium paid tools, various different tools. So I think as we kind of have some more conversations with them about their business needs on using these geocoders and maybe eventually transitioning towards the free option that we have available that's ideally using that more authoritative county data. It has a more kind of clear provenance on where the data is coming from. I think we are definitely open to running this analysis with different options. We've done a little bit of that, like I mentioned, with Esri versus Precisely, but we have not really done much of this through Google other than kind of one-off requests through it. And then that first one that you mentioned is one that's new to me. So I think we do have interest, haven't really gotten super far in that process yet, I guess is my general answer. And Jason, we do use this in the main search of Indiana Map. So that multi-role locator is kind of the primary search that Indiana Map uses. So if you're searching in the map viewer on Indiana Map, you're typically going to be matching your addresses to the data harvest data that we collect from the counties. And then for the specific layers, the address points and the center lines that we have on Indiana Map are the same ones that do get fed into the geocoder. So that kind of underlying reference data is available if that happens to be kind of the question you were asking. And we are at noon, so if anybody has any other questions, I can stick around for maybe another 2 minutes to see if anything else comes through the chat. But with that, I very much appreciate everybody taking the time to join us for the webinar today and hope you have a good rest of your day.